For a long time, the Magician Girl portion of the spellcaster type in Yu-Gi-Oh! Consisted of population Dark Magician Girl. However, last year, this population grew by leaps and bounds, as a new crop of supposed talent arrived on the scene. So, can these new girls cut it? Let's find out by examining a Magician Girl deck. Starting off with the direct support, like always, Kiwi is an interesting card because one would think that she would be more centered towards being a boss monster of sorts as one of the two tribute monsters in the group. But instead, she provides incredibly high-quality auxiliary support. When on the field, she sits only as an 1800 attacker, but grants Magispector status to herself and all other spellcasters. This effect is ridiculously useful. When in the hand, she can be discarded to increase the attack of all Magician Girls on the field, commonly by 600 to 1200 for a given turn. Too bad this increase was not applied to all spellcasters. The nature of Kiwi's effect is rather nice because other Magician Girls can bring her out via their effects with little trouble. The big problem with Kiwi on the field, though, is the Magician Girls lack a compatriot with an attack magnet effect. So when on the field, any smart opponent will make an attack beeline towards Kiwi, limiting the value of her Magispector-like blanket effect, unless you design your deck accordingly. Despite this huge deficiency in play strategy, 3 copies should be standard. Chocolate has a nice draw effect while also priming the graveyard to support her I dare you to attack me effect. Unfortunately, her 1600 attack is typically not enough to protect herself, for her attack deflection effect is only once per turn. However, the opponent will almost always have to spend at least one monster to remove Chocolate from the field via raw violence, i.e. battle, or burn a monster effect negation card. 3 copies. Apple has a much weaker attack deflection effect, costing a monster from hand, instead of getting a free one from the graveyard like Chocolate. However, the one major advantage of Apple's effect is that the opponent does not have common knowledge of what you have in your hand, relative to your graveyard, so you can surprise the opponent by dropping an unexpected monster, leading to some massive damage or some other positive effect. Her on-destruction effect is nice because it adds cards to the hand, especially Chocolate and Kiwi, but can be a small double-edged sword, taking away Chocolate fuel from the graveyard. Also, the additions to the hand aren't that useful because it is difficult at times for this deck to swarm due to a huge lack of special summoning capacity. To this point, I only like running 1 copy of Apple. Lemon is disappointing, and is a rather huge what-could-have-been card. First, the inability to tribute herself for the search is rather depressing because most of the time it takes valuable board presence, which this deck can struggle to establish. In addition to losing that board presence, there's not a lot of Magician Girls that you'd actually want to tribute from the field to get the search. Second, the fact that this card is only added to the hand instead of special summoned to the field is also depressing, even if it is any spellcaster monster in the game, which should be a huge boon, but just doesn't seem to turn out that way most of the time. Third, the monster receiving the attack deflection, having its effect negated, is also rather frustrating because it is negated period, rather than just for the given turn. So, yeah, Lemon, what could have been? I don't run any copies, and really never find myself lamenting that decision. Berry is the card that Lemon wishes she was. A Magician Girl search after a normal summons, and a deck Magician Girl summons when she is attacked or targeted by an opponent's effect. 2 very useful effects for getting Kiwi in hand, and Chocolate or Kiwi onto the field. Basically, Berry is what you get, in a sense, when you hybridize Stratos and Maiden with Eyes of Blue. To an extent. Unfortunately, Berry does not negate the attack after summoning from the deck, so she will more than likely just get run over sitting in defense position on the replay. However, thanks to the card effect Trigger, Berry is not the sitting duck that the other Magician Girls can be to various other effects. But sadly, while her effect is nice, right now this deck doesn't really have an amazing silver bullet monster in the Magician Girl arsenal, which mitigates some importance to her effect, although this is not Berry's fault at all. That said, Berry is a critical card for this deck, in the context that the sledding is much easier if you open her versus if you do not. 3 copies. Well, after looking at the monsters, there are a pair of glaring problems. First, for most of the Magician Girls that do something, the opponent has to attack them. With the rather low attack values associated with the Magician Girl, an opponent can just sit on a high attack power monster in attack mode, or a monster with a lot of defense points in defense mode, and refrain from attacking, preventing a lot of the momentum from these monsters. In some sense, placing a heavy reliance on Kiwi's attack increase effect, which you only have so much of and isn't the most consistent thing in the world. This attack power concern leads to the second problem. All of the Magician Girls have different levels and attributes, heavily limiting their ability to tap into XZ portion of the extra deck to get over these opponent blockades. Therefore, with these concerns in mind, the objective for the rest of the deck is to compensate for these problems with the other available support. While it is certainly possible to put the onus on the opponent to attack by running a card like Savage Colosseum, or outright force them to attack with a card like Battle Mania, instead, the somewhat generic attack deflection effects of Magician Girl monsters should be more of a deterrent, limiting the ability of the opponent to just outright sit on one monster to control the field. Basically, my strategy is to force the opponent to put multiple monsters on the field, and then attempt to net pluses from that additional extension. Before we get started with the other monsters, note that I do not run Dark Magician or Dark Magician Girl in this deck, because they don't really contribute anything positive, and are rather inefficient on their own, for their spell and trap support do not really support the Magician Girls. For the remaining monsters, while not necessary, I like running one copy of Dark Magician of Chaos as the boss monster of sorts for the deck, for while it has been nerfed, it is still a quality monster that can be rather easily put on the field by the Magician Girl's effect, and that banish effect it has when it destroys monsters can definitely do some work against multiple archetypes in the meta. I like running 2 copies of Kycoo the Ghost Destroyer, for it is a solid 1800 attack with a nice banish from the graveyard effect, along with a continuous effect that says no to your opponent banishing from either graveyard, which is rather a meaningful issue for a lot of other decks. Also, I run 1 copy of Fairy Tale Snow as a nice utility card, especially for its interruption effect and its ability to special summon itself, giving you an extra attacker to quicken your victories. Not surprisingly, I run 3 copies of Ghost Ogre Snow Rabbit. I prefer Ghost Ogre over Ash, but Ash works too, for both synchro access and getting rid of some of the major opponent threats, be it monster, spell, or trap. Finally, closing out the monsters, I run 2 copies of Juragedo as a means of getting over higher attack point monsters, in addition to hastening damage rushes, as well as 1 copy of Injection Fairy Lily for huge damage dealing and individual field clearance. Lily plus Kiwi on the field can be rather formidable. While I do run Snow, I only side Luna, because while it is a nice card, it does struggle against main deck threats versus extra deck threats with its return effect, because it can be negated much easier, and again its effect does result in its own return to the hand, which takes away field presence, which this deck strives for. As explained earlier, my strategy for this deck is to net pluses via the opponent having to overextend, in a sense, to remove the Magician Girls effectively from the field due to their attack deflection effects. This strategy is largely applied through the spell and trap card choices. For the spells, I run 1 copy of Raigeki and 2 copies of Darkhole for field clearance, 2 copies of Instant Fusion for extra deck versatility, 1 copy of 1-for-1 to get Barry on the field, for while you will not receive her search effect from 1-for-1, Barry on the field is definitely something you should be shooting for. 1 copy of Soul Charge for obvious reasons, 1 copy of Upstart Goblin, and 1 copy of Moon Mirror Shield, in large part to provide protection for Kiwi when she's on the field. Finally, tapping into some of that new support from Maximum Crisis, I run 3 copies of Magician's Left Hand. Now, in my experience, Magician's Right Hand is a nice card, but Magician's Left Hand is leaps and bounds better in this deck. Running into a Mirror Force variant when you've wrested control of the field from your opponent, or having a Solemn Strike wreck your Chocolate's attack deflection effect can be devastating for this deck, so having Left Hand available to stop it is definitely worth it. If one wants to go a more offensive route, then the left hands can be abandoned for a card like Solidarity or the Seal of Orichalcos. Also, I don't like running a card like Wonder Wand in this deck, because if one is going to run an equip spell for attack increase, there are a number of options that are better, and the draw effect with Wonder Wand again gives up field presence, which in my opinion this deck really should try to avoid. Moving on to the traps, I run 1 copy of Solemn Warning and 1 copy of Torrential Tribute as the standard staples for important summons negation and board clearance. I also run 3 copies of Call of the Haunted for re-establishing board presence, especially with Kiwi, for Kiwi will not be destroyed if Call is removed. Finally, again, attempting to take advantage of the opponent typically needing to extend to remove monsters, I run 3 copies of Needle Sealing for those pluses. Running Sealing also works very well thanks to Kiwi's protection effect. Therefore, your monsters count towards its activation condition, but won't be destroyed by it. In my opinion, because this deck wants the opponent to have no monsters on the field as often as possible, Solemns and Horns as trap options have trouble doing that in the crazy swarm the field meta that currently exists. This deck's most difficult matchup is True Draco, because of the potential for that deck to field a 3250 attack masterpiece that is immune to monster, spell, and trap effect, and thanks to Diagram, in addition to that attack increase, can shrug off battle destruction once per turn. Now, this deck can remove monsters via monster, spell, or trap effect, so the key to that matchup is obviously preventing that perfect masterpiece, so to speak. For the extra deck, I run the following: 1 Sea Monster of Theseus, 1 Kamionwizard, largely for making Perforamage Trapeze Magician much easier, the level 4 spellcaster, 1 copy of Thousand Eyes Restrict, 1 Vermillion Dragon Mech, 1 Crimson Blader, 1 PSY-Framelord Omega, 1 Black Rose Moonlight Dragon, 1 Black Rose Dragon, 1 Arcanite Magician, 1 Old Entity Hastorr, 1 Perforamage Trapeze Magician, 1 Castel the Skyblaster Musketeer, 1 Sylvan Princess Sprite. I usually make that with a Thousand Eyes Restrict that has gobbled up an opponent's monster, and a berry. And finally, one last hurrah before Link Summoning, in a sense, for the Nightmare combo of 1 number S39 Utopia the Lightning, and 1 number 39 Utopia. In the end, clearly this deck build focuses on a more pure version of the deck versus a hybridized version incorporating pendulums, largely the Magicians, Shaddolls, or Invoked. In my opinion, the problem with Magician Girls in any of these hybrids is that they actually seem to detract from the competitiveness of those decks in a more pure or other hybrid form. For example, almost any version of Pendulum Magicians will be better than Magician Girl Pendulum Magicians. This hybridization strategy also seems to be somewhat inefficient for Magician Girls because these decks do little to support the general strength of Magician Girls, so a more pure build seemed appropriate. Overall, the deck does have some potential, but in the fast-paced world that is the current and expected future Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta, despite Link Summoning, the deck needs more. However, similar to a deck like Fortune Lady, it is difficult to determine when or if that help will even come. Well, that is my Magician Girl deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.